I'm excited to begin a new summer series today on the life of Moses. And if you've spent any time in the scripture, you've heard about Moses. He's kind of the man, the myth, the legend. There's actually more to Moses' life than we're going to cover this summer. We're going to mainly focus on his life in the book of Exodus. There's things that happen with Moses beyond the book of Exodus. And we're going to begin with the story of his birth today, working all the way through that famous incident with the golden calf later in the summer. And just to clarify, we're focusing on highlights of Moses' life, not necessarily every verse in every chapter in the 40 chapters in the book of Exodus. We'd be here till next summer on Exodus if we did that. So I'm going to give you a little backstory this morning, and kind of bear with me. This is not the exciting part, but kind of necessary to set the stage for the series. So Israel's story really began with a vision from Abraham, with Abraham. Abraham was a man of God, and God made this covenant with Abraham, and he said, "You're going to become the exalted father of many nations." But Abraham grew old, and he never had any children with his wife Sarah until, when it seemed like beyond all odds, they had a son in their old age, and they named him Isaac. Isaac became the father of Jacob, and that's where we really begin to see the idea of a nation taking form. God renamed Jacob and called him Israel, and he had 12 sons, and they were the founding fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, you remember the story that there was a great famine, and during a severe famine, they all went to Egypt for relief. There's a longer story. It involves Joseph and all of that. But Israel's son Joseph had gained a unique position with the Pharaoh in Egypt and was credited really with seeing everyone in that surrounding area, that region, with famine relief. And he gained such influence and navigated that famine for the Egyptians and for his own family that basically they were welcomed to the land. They were given holdings and standing in Egypt, and everything was going fine during the lifetime of Joseph and Israel's sons. And that's where Exodus chapter 1 picks up. Eventually a new king came to power in Egypt, who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, "Look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if wars break out, they'll join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape from our country." So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. The Egyptians saw the Israelites as a threat. There were too many of them, and so they did what many have done in the courses of history. They used their power to enslave powerless people. And so the Hebrew became the property of Pharaoh and the nation of Egypt. But the Hebrew people kept growing. They kept having big families, lots of kids, and they were really becoming kind of a threat, a perceived threat to the Egyptians. And so the Pharaoh did something kind of unthinkable. He issued a command to kill all of the Hebrew baby boys. If you don't know the fancy word for that, that's infanticide. It's the execution, the systematic execution of babies in order to prevent the growth of a population or to exterminate a whole group of people. Whatever bad things you think are going on in America today, and there are some, there are worse things that have gone on in the course of history, and this is one of them. The people were enslaved and their babies were being taken and killed. That's the world that Moses was born into. And sometimes you hear people say, like, "Man, I wouldn't want to bring a child into the world today." Imagine bringing a child into that world. And here's the story, how his story begins in chapter 2 now. "About this time, a man and woman from the tribe of Levi got married. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby and kept him hidden for 3 months. So Moses' parents were both from the same tribe. They were from the tribe of Levi, which would eventually become the priestly tribe. It's one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And we learn elsewhere that his parents' names were Amram and Jochebed. So if you're planning on having babies in the near future and need some good Bible names, Amram and Jochebed should probably make the list. Even within their enslavement, there was love, there was marriage, there was family, and this Levite couple became pregnant, and they had a son. And this son, Moses, opened his eyes to a very hostile world. I think about that a lot for our Christian kids. My kids are the age and stage of life where we're expecting grandkids like, any old day now. And I think about the world that my grandchildren will be born into, a world that is increasingly set against people of faith. But in Moses' day, it was actually worse. There were agents of the government hunting down Hebrew boys, and when they found them, they were instructed to simply toss them into the Nile River. It's hard to even imagine what that would be like to witness that happening in our own community. His parents were able to hide him for 3 months, but you kind of realize what's going to happen. The baby starts walking, the baby starts talking, and it gets harder and harder to hide the presence of this child. They knew they would eventually be discovered. And so it says in verse 3, when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch, and she put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Now, I've seen like Sunday school pictures of this scene when I was a kid, and it always looks like very serene. There's like this very happy little baby, and he's floating in this little basket, and it's kind of a beautiful setting. And this is like a traumatic scene, okay? You're putting your baby in a basket and sending him down the river that's filled with crocodiles, okay? This was not like a nice little scene. If they had discovered, and you say, well, why would they do that? It's unthinkable. Why would they do that? Because if they were discovered hiding the baby, their entire family would be killed. So the choice is, do we all want to be killed or have our baby killed? And I mean, gosh, what do you do? So there's horrific circumstances. There's tough decisions that have to be made. Life and death is at stake. What would you do? And if you've ever felt like you were in a no-win situation, that's what this is. You can kind of maybe relate to what that would feel like for them. So Moses was laid in the basket, in the reeds, and it says in verse 4, the baby sister stood at a distance watching to see what would happen. I always kind of wonder what that means. Was she what's going to happen? Or maybe hoping something good's going to happen? Or whatever the case, she was standing there. Some believe this is Miriam, who later played a prominent role in Israel's history. She's watching the basket, and something providential happens. Verse 5 says, soon Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, and her attendants walked along the riverbank. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it for her. And when the princess opened it, she saw the baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This must be one of the Hebrew children, she said. Now, you have to catch the irony here. Pharaoh is the one responsible for killing the baby boys. Pharaoh's the one who gave the order to throw them in the river and not let any of them live. And who comes to take the Hebrew baby boy out of the river? Pharaoh's own daughter. Hey, Dad, look what I found. Can I keep it? Right? And so Miriam saw her big chance, and she was smart. She took it. She said, in verse 7, the baby sister approached the princess and said, should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse this baby for you? Yes, do, the princess replied. So the girl went and called the baby's mother. So Moses' mother, listen to this, gave up her son one day and got him right back. It's interesting in my life of faith that I find over and over again that I have to give things up to have what I want. And sometimes the thing that I felt like I had to give up on is the very thing that God turns around and gives me. But it's this thing with God where it's Eric, not on your terms, on mine. God works that way. Sometimes we have to surrender the things that we want the most, and then they come right back in a way or in a form. Not always. So they give away the baby. They get him right back. So for a time, Moses was actually raised by his own family in his own home, by his own mom, and she got paid. So that's pretty cool. Verse 10, later when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. So there was a season that she got to actually have Moses at home with the family. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, I lifted him out of the water. If you want to kind of nerd out, some of the Bible scholars like to debate what Moses' name was prior to the adoption, because Pharaoh's daughter is actually the one who named him Moses. We don't know, and there's different ideas, and you can research it if you like. But that's about as much as we know about the childhood of Moses. So he was raised as an Egyptian in royalty, but his ethnicity was Hebrew. And from from that tidbit, we gain some insights that might actually be important. The first thing to notice is that Moses was considered a special baby. Depending on the translation you look at, some will say beautiful, some will say fine. He's a fine child, a beautiful child. There was something exceptional about this child that stood out from very early on. And we've all had this experience, right, where someone shows us the picture of their grandchild and says, "Isn't this the most beautiful baby you've ever seen?" And you're thinking, well, not really, because apparently you have not seen my children or my grandchildren, who are clearly the most beautiful children that you've ever seen. Now, I don't think verse 2 is actually talking about the appearance of Moses per se. I'm sure he was a cute kid, right? But I want to propose that his mother, Jochebed, noticed something different about him. And I think it has something to do with the Lord and his calling on the life of Moses. Because we have this kind of American Disneyland kind of like approach to life, we kind of walk around with this idea that every single child has unlimited potential, that his own or her own unique destiny, and they're all bound to accomplish something amazing. I mean, that's just kind of the American way of like looking at life. And I don't want to discourage anyone from that. As Christians, we kind of believe that. We have a child and we hope and pray that our kids will go on to accomplish great things and be great people. And as Christians, we add that we want the blessing of God to be on their life as well. And I want my kid to reach their maximum potential. And that, God stuff too. Well, what made Moses special, I don't think, was his latent leadership potential, but God's plan for his life. And to say that more simply, the most important thing about Moses wasn't Moses. It was God. And that's our first point of application this morning. God has a plan for our lives. I know that sounds kind of cliche, but it's just so true. God has a plan for our lives. God planned for Moses to be the deliverer of Israel. And that plan was in motion before Moses was even born. He didn't know it. His parents didn't know it. Pharaoh didn't know it. But God's funny that way. He doesn't always feel the need to include us in on his plans. The most important thing about Moses had little to do with Moses. It wasn't who he was, it's who he knew. And the same is true for us. But we don't always see it that way. The most important thing for us is who we know, and we know Jesus Christ. But we don't always think of it that way. We have this kind of mass narcissism in America where we think, each one of us, by the way, think that we are the center of the universe. And so what I think is the most important thing that anyone can think, and my opinions are the highest, my belief of what truth is the highest, my aspirations, my goals, my dreams, these are the highest pursuits, and everybody else better get out of the way because I'm the most important. We're told that we can be all we can be and do everything we want and should do anything that we want to do, and the world is our oyster. Go out and get it, make it, have it, do it. Don't let anyone get in the way. And a lot of Christians operate that way. And just try to add some God stuff in at the end. I'm going to live my life my way, and Jesus. Well, here's what Jesus said about that. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Jesus said that the highest pursuit in the Christian life is not self-actualization, it's not accomplishment, it's not career, it's a life instead of self-promotion, it's self-denial. The Christian life is a constant life of self-denial, of not giving yourself what you want at times, not doing the things that feel good or even natural to you, doing the things that he's asked us to do, even if it costs us. He says, whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. The secret to happiness in this life is not doing whatever you want. Everyone's trying that, and most people are basically miserable, right? So the secret in life is to deny yourself, lose your life, and he says, when you give up your hopes and dreams and aspirations and all that, and what I mean by that is like, put them on the table, not throw them in the garbage, but just put them on the table and say, Lord, what do you want me to do? When you do that, you find real life. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world and forfeit their soul, Jesus asked. Now, I know that's hard to hear and maybe hard to understand, but here's the thing. Life isn't about you, and it's not about me. We're not the center of the universe. Your wants and needs are not the most important things. What makes you special is not what you have or anything you know how to do, or any ability you possess. What makes you special, and you are special, what makes you special is who you know. You know your Heavenly Father. You're not special because your mama told you so. You're special because your father said so. The thing that sets you apart from other people in the world is the same thing that set Moses apart, that you're known and loved by the God of heaven. And I mean, just soak that in. You're known and loved by the God of heaven. He loves you and has a plan for you and His will for you. And it doesn't revolve around you. It revolves around His Son and His kingdom. And we have to get this straight in our minds. Being a Christian is a life of self-denial, where we lay down rights, give away money, sign up for hardship, stand for things that people don't like, set aside old allegiances, set aside our opinions, shake off ideologies and the philosophies of the world. We lay down our lives. Being a disciple isn't coming to church for an hour once a week or once a month. It's a life we live. We don't squeeze Jesus into our life. Jesus is our life. And He said, if you want life, you've got to lose yours and pick up the one that I got for you. Whoever loses their life for Him, He says, will find it. And what we see in the life of Moses is that from birth, God had this special plan. And so after being taken from the water by Pharaoh and Pharaoh's daughter, he was eventually taken in by royalty. And the Bible doesn't say a lot about this. I had an old mentor named Terry O'Casey, who's gone now. And he said, sometimes when you read the Bible, you have to do some holy imagineering, he called it. You know, the Bible doesn't say, so you got to kind of think a little bit. And so some of the things you can think about the life of Moses early on was that he would have been formally educated along with all the other royal children. He would have had the best of the fine foods and clothing. He would have had great accommodations. He was literally living in the lap of luxury, positioned in the family of the most powerful person on the planet at that time. It's not unlikely that he had some military or combat training. He certainly was taught their language, their customs, their religion. He had a very interesting upbringing. And all along, God had strategically positioned Moses to be in the right place at the right time to eventually be the one who would lead His people out of slavery. But here's the crazy part, guys. We're not sure how well Moses actually knew God, or even if he knew God, or what he was up to. The Israelites had been enslaved for 400 years, and nothing was changing. And I think that's another point of application, is that we have to remember that in our own story. We can't always see what God's doing right now, but we can trust that He's always doing something. We're wondering at times, God, what are you doing? What is going on? What are you up to up there? Things have been going a certain way for a long time. You feel a little stuck. You feel like things aren't breaking free. You're not sure what's going to happen. You may be poor people like Moses' family, or rich people like his adopted family, waiting for a sign, waiting for a signal, waiting for some direction from God. Or you might just get tired of waiting and just take matters into your own hands. And that's usually, by the way, when things go off the rails. You're tired of waiting for a Christian spouse, and so you just find a warm body. You're tired of your marriage, waiting for your marriage to heal, so you just bail out. You're tired of waiting for God's direction, so you just launch out in a direction and hope it works out. You're tired of waiting on the Lord, so you just do what you want to do. That's what Moses eventually did. So we're fast forwarding now. The childhood of Moses, now verse 11. Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people. They lived in a certain region in Egypt. So he goes to visit his people. He knew his ethnic background, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. And during his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. So you kind of get the scene. Here he is, like this kind of like a royal guy, of coming into his home region, and as he's, pulling in on a chariot or whatever, there's a guy beating one of his fellow Hebrew people. And so, we're not sure how close he is at this point. You can imagine it might be kind of hard to watch the scene unfolding. I mean, anybody here, if you saw someone being beaten, it would grab your attention. You'd want to jump in, make it stop. So he saw an Egyptian man beating a Hebrew man, and a thought came to his mind. And it wasn't a good thought. We aren't told a lot of details, but here's what happened in verse 12. After looking in all directions to make sure no one is watching, so he's like taking a long look, and then it says that he killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. He made sure the coast was clear, and then he killed a guy. Man, there's just no way to spin that. It's murder. He literally put a guy in the ground. It wasn't justified. It wasn't self-defense. He wasn't acting as an agent of the law. And it kind of gives you a glimpse of the mindset of Moses at this time. Why did Pharaoh's grandson think he could just kill somebody? I think that he was probably a little entitled. I think he was probably a little arrogant. He decided in that moment that he was judge, juror, and executioner. He thought he could do whatever he wanted. He wasn't being godly, at least in that moment. He was full of himself. He's full of anger. He's full of malice. And there are lots of people like that in the world. People that wander into churches on Sunday morning and call themselves Christians, and they have this arrogant, entitled attitude. No one tells me what to do. I do what I want. I don't care what the Bible says. And there's a pain that's waiting for such people. When you're arrogant and flippant and entitled and full of yourself, there's pain ahead. How do I know that? Because the last time I killed an Egyptian slave driver, it didn't go very well. See if you guys are still awake. Because every time, how do I know? Because every time I've acted apart from God, I always suffer for it. Sometimes instantly, sometimes eventually. When we operate in our own will and our own strength and our own defiance of God's will and defiance of His word, it always brings pain. And it did for Moses. The next day, he's still in town. When Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. People just fighting everywhere over there. "Why are you beating up your friend?" Moses said to the one who'd started the fight. And the man replied, "Who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" And you can imagine like the pit in his stomach, like people know about that. Like word is out. They know that I killed that guy. The man he saved from the beating apparently wasn't very loyal. He went around and told everybody about what Moses had done. And he didn't keep it on the down low or show appreciation. He kind of blabbed it to everybody. So then it says Moses was afraid. Everyone knows what I did. And sure enough, Pharaoh heard about what happened, and he tried to kill Moses. Pharaoh apparently didn't think that much of his adopted grandson. He's ready to kill him. So Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. See, your sins will find you out. Your sins come back to haunt you. Therefore, whatsoever a man sows, that also will he reap. Your sins will find you out. So Moses did something, and kind of an instant next day consequence. Pharaoh tried to have him killed. We aren't told exactly what happened, but something went down. Moses was somehow able to slip away, and he went to the land of Midian, which is somewhere to the south. Second point of application this morning. Our plans, I should emphasize our plans are often contrary to God's plans. It wasn't God's plan for Moses to murder a guy. And that brings up just an important interpretation principle I wanted to say this morning. There are a lot of things in the Bible, and people that aren't Christians will point to those things and say, look what's in the Bible. This is a horrible book. Well, remember, some things in the Bible are just history. This is not God's endorsement of murdering Egyptian slave drivers. This is an account of what happened with one of God's people. It was not God's will for Moses to murder a guy. God doesn't want anyone to murder anyone. And not every story in the Bible has good examples to follow. And this is one of those stories. Ironically, it occurred to me this morning, it was Moses who would have to stand before the people eventually and give them the command that says, thou shalt not kill. That must have stung a little bit. How might his life have been different if he hadn't killed that man? His plan detoured him away from God's plan. You know, when I moved to Twin Falls, I had this thing, when you come in from I-84, there's that exit for Twin Falls. Has anyone ever missed that turn besides me? If you miss that turn, it's a 20-minute mistake, right? And it only takes 3 or 4 times for me to do that before I realize that's my turn, right? There's nothing more frustrating than making a stupid mistake that just sets you back, and it's dumb, right? And that's how it is when we try to go without God. I've got an idea. I've got this perfect plan. It's going to be great. I've got it all mapped out. And we haven't even bothered to run it by the man upstairs. And you know what's really cool about God? He can still accomplish his purposes in spite of us. He can accomplish them with us, but he also can accomplish them in spite of us. Proverbs 19:21 comes to mind. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. And guys, we want that. We want the Lord's purpose to prevail. Making mistakes is part of the human experience. It's certainly part of the Christian experience. Sometimes our mistakes set us back significantly, sometimes only a little bit, but God's purposes are always accomplished with or without us. And making mistakes doesn't get us kicked off his team, and I'm so thankful for that because I've made a lot of mistakes. It may sound crazy to say this, but God can even work with murderers. He can forgive and redeem and use people that are really messed up. God can work through our fears and our failures. And that's great news because some of us are really messed up. And Moses flees Egypt and goes into Midian. And it says when Moses arrived in Midian, he sat down beside a well. And the priest of Midian had 7 daughters who came as usual to draw water and fill the water troughs for their father's flocks. But some shepherds came and chased them away. And so Moses jumped up and rescued the girls from the shepherds, and then he drew water for their flocks. So Moses did some pretty cool stuff when he's an older guy, but he's still young, and it seems like he's got this kind of fighter kind of personality. Did you catch that? He sees a guy being beaten, and he murders the guy. He sees some women being given a hard time by some shepherds, and so he comes to their aid. He's a fighter, kind of a young guy. He's ready to tangle with some shepherds to save some pretty girls. And when the girls returned to rule their father, he asked, "Why are you back so soon today?" "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds," they answered, "and they drew water for us and watered, he drew water for us and watered our flocks." Notice that God's man still looked and talked and sounded Egyptian. They saw him and said, "An Egyptian guy, not a Hebrew guy." He very much had adopted the culture and the look and the swagger of the Egyptians. And the father says, "Where is he? Why did you leave him there? Invite him to come and eat with us." Moses accepted the invitation and settled there with him. In time, Reuel gave Moses his daughter Zipporah, another strong Bible name, to be his wife. So if you're single, here's a pro tip. Hang out at wells, a great place to meet wives. Later, she gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, for he explained, "I have been a foreigner in a foreign land." Here's something that's crazy. At the start of Exodus 3, and this is kind of giving you a little primer for next Sunday, 40 years have passed. And that's another thing about reading the Bible. Sometimes we don't realize when we're reading the story of Jesus or the story of a man like Moses, we don't realize that significant time can pass from one chapter to another, and it really makes a difference in how we understand the story. So Moses spent 40 years in Midian before we get to chapter 3, and what was he doing? He was working for his father-in-law as a shepherd. He went from a place of power and influence to the lowliest job imaginable. He stood outside, come rain or shine, and watched sheep for 40 years. Some of you hate your jobs. Can I just say? It could be worse. And it was. His father-in-law was his boss. Not cool, right? So from palace to pasture, from luxury to poverty, from young to old, everyone would think if they met Moses, old Moses, that shepherd guy, that he'd lived beyond his usefulness. But here's the thing. Moses had to unlearn some things before God could use him. Moses had to unlearn some things before God could use him. And I know that there are people here this morning that feel like, why am I here? What's my contribution? How is God going to use me? And can I just suggest to you that maybe before God can use you in the ways you envision him or want him to, maybe you need to unlearn some things. Our failures are opportunities for growth. I'm sure Moses had days when he couldn't believe how his life turned out. I'm sure he had those days where he's like, I wish I wouldn't have killed that guy. It's cost me my entire life. I'm sure Moses had those days where he's dreaming about the fine foods and the fine accommodations and the fancy clothes and all the life in the courts of Pharaoh. And now here he is on the hillside kicking himself over and over again. But what he never saw coming is that God would use the older, wiser man that he'd become, the humble man in humble circumstances. He'd use that man to save a nation. Guys, sometimes we think that our past has already determined our future. I know we buy into that lie from the pit of hell sometimes, that your past has already determined your future and there's no going back. That's just nonsense. Your failures only determine your future if you don't learn the lesson. The painful lessons are the ones that make us better and stronger and more capable. One of my favorite things to say to young guys when they say something that I think is wrong is I say, well, life will beat that out of you. You'll have some opportunities to learn that that's just not true. The painful lessons that we all have to learn make us better, stronger, and more capable. They teach us what we don't know. They teach us that we don't know as much as we think we do. Those hard life lessons are the anvil on which God is refining us and honing us to be the best version of who he wants us to be. Our failures humble us and make us more likely to listen. God had a special plan for the life of Moses, and Moses' mistakes did not change that. His mistakes were the training ground for him to be the most godly, wise, and one of the most godly, wise, and virtuous leaders to ever walk the earth. It's over 3,000 years later, and here we are still talking about a man named Moses. His past didn't define his future. God took his failures and turned them around. And as we continue in this series, we'll see that his time spent shepherding those sheep became the training grounds for shepherding a nation. And the time that he spent in the wilderness became the opportunity where his faith and character were forged. And all these years later, his time spent in the palace of Egypt as a child prepared him for a showdown with Pharaoh's court. And the man who left Egypt on the run would eventually return and lead all of God's people to a promised land. Now here's a little teaser for next week at the end of chapter 2. Years passed, the king of Egypt died, but the Israelites continued to groan under their burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time to act. Can I just give you a closing thought this morning that whatever circumstance or situation you're in, if life hasn't gone the way that you want it to, if ministry hasn't gone the way you want it to, if you feel like you've waited and you've asked God and nothing's happened, can I just encourage you to wait, to be patient, to stay put, to keep praying, keep searching, keep seeking. Jesus said if you do that, the doors will be open. There's going to be a point for people that are living faithful lives with Jesus where God taps you on the shoulder and says, I haven't forgotten, I've remembered, and now is the time.